So 6 days out of the new A-League campaign, I should be talking about my ladder predictions for the 2021 season. Instead, I find myself talking about fixtures being postponed or rescheduled due to the coronavirus outbreak in Sydney's northern beaches. Now, for those that have been living under a rock in the past week, a coronavirus outbreak has occurred in the Sydney's northern beaches, which has caused every other Australian state to close their borders to Greater Sydney, or in the case of WA, all of New South Wales. This has proved problematic for the A-League because it means that non-New South Wales based sides can't actually fly out of New South Wales without actually having to quarantine for 2 weeks. So they essentially have to quarantine for 2 weeks coming out from a game in Sydney. And here's the worst thing. 6 of the 12 A-League teams are actually based in New South Wales. That's half the league. So that just makes playing games all the more tougher. So what should the A-League do in terms of the fixture to start the season? Apparently postponing games. The head of Football Leagues, Greg O'Rourke, has said that he is prepared to postpone A-League matches which are affected by border closures, even those between like 2 New South Wales teams, just because it's being played in Sydney. My opinion, that is not the right path to go down because games can still be played. In the case of all New South Wales clash, I think those can still go ahead because at the moment there aren't actually like massive restrictions on the amount of people in an outdoor gathering like there was in the first lockdown back in March. So games can still be played. It's just whether it be played behind closed doors or whether it actually be played in front of fans. And as for the other states, well, they can just play amongst each other for the first few rounds, and they can just keep doing that. You can split the league in half. You can have all the Victorian, the Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth teams all play in one mini league, and then you have the 6 New South Wales based sides. Remember, Wellington's in Wollongong now. All the 6 New South Wales based sides are playing in their own mini league, and they basically complete all their games. There's 70 games between them, 35 in the non-New South Wales sector, 35. Sorry, let me repeat that. 35 between non-New South Wales teams and 35 which involve all New South Wales teams. You've got 70 of those games all up, and those can be the first 70 games of the A-League season, should games in New South Wales still be able to be played there. And after the first 70 games have been played, if the borders between New South Wales and the rest of the states are still not opened yet, then the 6 New South Wales teams can leave New South Wales and base themselves in either Victoria or wherever. There are 42 games to be played between a New South Wales opponent and a non-New South Wales opponent, where the non-New South Wales opponent is the home team, whether that's in Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane or Perth. 42 of those games would be played, and after that, all 12 teams would base themselves in New South Wales and play the remaining 44 games, which in every case it would be 1 New South Wales team and 1 non-New South Wales team played at the New South Wales team's home ground. And then after that, they can there could be a 1 week bye, kind of similar to the AFL, where after round 23 there's a pre-finals bye. The A-League could have that, which allows teams to quarantine in their home state before playing their eliminational semi-final. What they could also do is have a floating schedule in the final round, so the finalists can play on the Thursday, Friday, and maybe the early Saturday slots, so that they don't have to play a final on a Monday, for example. So that's what they could do, and then they just manage the finals from there, see how that goes. Here's the catch. My plan would only work if New South Wales avoided a lockdown. Now, I know what most of you are thinking. Well, if New South Wales is not in a lockdown, wouldn't the borders reopen sooner rather than later? Well, you're right. But there is that slight chance that not a serious outbreak occurs in New South Wales, but they go several months getting about like 10 cases a day. In that case, while you wouldn't have to go into a lockdown, I don't think other states would actually want to open their borders to New South Wales until they hit 0. But even if the borders reopen, because coronavirus, the situation changes so quickly, and the fact that The league needs to get grounds booked and flights booked. They don't want to be changing the fixture too many times, so I think it's probably better that model works even if the borders are open, so that in the event of an outbreak, there won't have to be serious changes made to the fixture. But if a full-blown outbreak occurs in Sydney and they had to be put into a lockdown similar to the one in Melbourne, then things could become very problematic for the A-League fixture. In that case, all 6 New South Wales sides would have to leave New South Wales permanently, and they'd probably have to base themselves in Melbourne. I'd say Melbourne so that basically you've got 9 of the 12 teams in the one location, which reduces flight costs. Means that only Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane will be flying in and out, and obviously the teams having to go up to those places. But yeah, I'd say in that case, most of the games would be played at Amy Park. You'd have the odd occasional game at Marvel Stadium, and the odd occasional low-drawing game, like between the Mariners and probably Mariners and Adelaide, for example, at Lakeside Oval, which was South Melbourne's ground. I guess if you want to go regional, a couple of other choices could include GMHBA Stadium and Mars Stadium. They might get a few as well. But I'd say the bulk of them would be Amy Park, given it's the only appropriate soccer ground in Melbourne, and probably Lakeside Oval will probably be those two that get the most games in that case. Seriously, Melbourne need to get some more soccer grounds. One in Tania and one in Dandenong. Come on, let's go. In that case, if the situation in Sydney doesn't look like to be improving, then you might find that Sydney Wanderers and all the other New South Wales teams would actually have to play home games in Victoria. Now, that's a worst case scenario here. Hopefully that doesn't happen. That's a worst case scenario if something similar like what happened in Melbourne last year occurs again in Sydney. And if Melbourne gets hit with coronavirus, I guess you go to Brisbane, because they've got quite a few soccer grounds there. They've got Suncorp, Redcliffe, Ballimore, those Seabus, got a couple up in the north. And then if Queensland gets hit, well, Adelaide and Perth. Anyway, the other thing that I could suggest in that case is, could A-League return back to Wellington if games can't be played in New South Wales? Because couldn't something happen like Wellington and their opposition fly to Wellington, play on the same day, so they go from the airport straight to Sky Stadium, and they play their game in front of fans, but the fans will not be allowed in the front tier, will be in the back tiers, so that the ball doesn't get kicked over there, for example, so they're not close to the fans. So the fans would only be allowed in the back tiers and not the front tier. But couldn't something happen that Wellington and their opposition, they go to Sky Stadium, straight from the airport, and then straight back to the airport and straight back to Australia? And why I also include Wellington in this is because while Wellington would be continuously looping their 14 days quarantine if they were to stay in New Zealand. So I think while they base themselves in Australia so they don't have to be in constant quarantine, because of that travel bubble, because that's open, you could have a situation where Wellington and their opposition go straight to the ground and then straight back into Australia, and then you just keep doing that when Wellington want to play. That would ease up a few games, and I think that would be about I'd say you'd get 15 less games in Melbourne probably, especially when it'll be congested with only a couple grounds there. So what would round 1 look like? Well, I'd say that the Wanderers MacArthur game can still go ahead on the Sunday, because at the moment, games can still be played in Sydney. There isn't actually any restrictions on games yet, and I'm sure there'll still be a crowd in that game, albeit probably not a full crowd. It'll probably be a capacity capped crowd, but there'd probably still be a crowd. And in the worst case scenario, that game can be played behind closed doors if things get to worst. Monday's game between United and Adelaide can go ahead because the Victorian South Australian border's open. Thursday's game between the Mariners and Newcastle can go ahead because it's same state travel. And again, games can be played in New South Wales still. Tuesday's where things get interesting because Brisbane are due to play Wellington, but Wellington, given that they're based in Wollongong, can't actually go up to Queensland. Likewise, on Wednesday, the Melbourne City-Sydney game's in doubt, because while Melbourne City can actually go up to Sydney and play that game, it's coming back and having to do 2 weeks quarantine, which will be the issue in that case. I think all it requires is a simple swap. Brisbane can still play a game on Tuesday at Redcliffe Oval, but instead of playing Wellington, they play Melbourne City. So it's the same venue, same time, just a different opponent. Likewise with Sydney on Wednesday. Same venue, same time, just a different opponent. In that case, it's Wellington. They can go up from Wollongong, play at Jubilee Oval, then go back down to Wollongong. In either of those cases, it's not going to be an issue because in Wednesday's case, same state travel. In Tuesday's case, the borders between Victoria and Queensland are open, so that game can go ahead. If there's one thing that everyone should learn from this video is that you need to be creative with solving issues such as what's happening at the moment, because the FA are saying they're going to postpone games. Well, they shouldn't just postpone games and leave big holes in the calendar, especially when games can still be played. Okay, not under the circumstances that are currently scheduled at the moment, but they can make changes to the schedule, they can shuffle around games, and they can still have constant football without breaching the laws. That's what the FFA should be doing instead of just postponing games altogether. So yeah, I think, as I said, that three fixture zone type system, that might be a consideration. Also, having a non-New South Wales hub might be the worst case scenario. Anyway, I hope you liked the video. Please subscribe. Please give this video a thumbs up. Please comment what you think of the video down below and how the FFA should handle this situation. Check out some other videos, and I will be uploading my ladder predictions for the 2021 A-League season. I will do that. It's going to be a busy week on KD Studios. Anyway, I will see you, I think tomorrow, because I'm doing the Tuesday talk. I'll see you on the Tuesday talk tomorrow. Goodbye.